Now, in the twilight of his administration, President Joe Biden is doing everything he can to flood Ukraine with more weapons of war, more ammunition. It's hard to say exactly for what he's saying. We're going to talk about in a minute what his intent is, and what's actually going to happen are probably not the same as what he's saying. But we're going to try and assess, what the impact of that may be on the course of the war. And in fact, can it have any impact? And we have with us to discuss this today somebody new to our channel. We're very excited to have him, and that is retired Commodore from the UK Navy, from the Royal Navy, Steve Jeremy. Steve, first of all, welcome to the show. Really delighted to have you on today.
Thank you very much, Danny. I'm a great fan of the show, and I think there'll be lots of people like me who thank you for two reasons, which is firstly, we're interested in the show, but also we get something that we don't get from the mainstream media, and thank goodness for it, because I don't know about what it's like over there, but here in this country, the mainstream media seem to be completely oblivious to what's actually going on the ground.
First of all, let's take a look at where we are right now. So the U.S. administration under President Joe Biden is heading out. He's had almost 3 years to try and get this thing sorted out, try and use all these different methods and means and capabilities to give it to the Ukraine side, et cetera, to try to achieve the victory for the Ukraine and the defeat for Russia. Yeah. Never happened. It didn't happen in the offensive in 2023, and it certainly is not happening on the defensive in 2024. And yet, after President-elect Trump was elected, and he is unequivocally saying he's going to have a negotiated settlement to end the war, we have the current administration doing this.
Today, the president approved a new security assistance package for Ukraine that will provide them with additional air defense, artillery, drones, and armored vehicles. It's the 72nd such drawdown package announced by the United States, and as the president made clear, we're going to continue to provide additional packages right up to the end of this administration to make sure Ukraine can continue to defend itself, so that if and when this comes to some sort of negotiation, that President Zelensky is in the best possible position, that has the most leverage possible, that he has the most success on the battlefield that he can take into that negotiation. That has included additional policy guidance that President Biden issued not long ago to allow for some long-range missile systems to be used to help Ukraine defend itself across that border, and that policy still stands.
Now, let's just examine that first of all, from a strategic possibility. It is at least a plausible thought to say, hey, let's increase the pain enough on the Russians so that when the next guy comes in here to negotiate, he has some more leverage to go. So per se, as far as it goes, that's something to actually consider. But then you have to look at how that would manifest itself on the ground, and that's where the whole thing falls apart. And that's one of my concerns about setting strategy, because it sounds like that someone in the Biden administration has believed that flooding the zone with several billion more dollars before they get out of office is going to do something on the ground to Russia. Do you think that's actually going to happen?
No, I don't. I mean, I think it's. I mean, as military men, I mean, I look at the use of Western missiles deep into Russia, a bit like the Germans using V1 and V2 rockets against Britain in the Second World War. It was never going to make a difference to what was going on the ground, and it's the same with this. I mean, I think in the financial world, they have an expression called risk-free reward. You invest something and hopefully there's no risk, but you get lots of money back. We seem to be doing the opposite here, which is reward-free risk. But that we know that these missiles will make no significant difference at all. And yet we seem to be doing, notwithstanding the escalatory dangers that we're running into with the use of these weapons. So it concerns me. I'm not quite so concerned as I was, but at the time when I heard that we were authorizing them, it really was one of those few things that kept me up at night. But again, I can't see any benefit. I think there's also an interesting thing, which is that I think what most people haven't realized is that actually we are being outproduced, and that we've got in Russia, although people talk about it as a small country in terms of GDP, industrially, it's outproducing the whole of the US and Europe put together. So that just shows you how GDP is not a very good way to think through how powerful the country is. I think the two issues that spring to mind for me are the industrial capability as well. In the Second World War, I think Britain had mobilized very quickly, and America was the great energy superpower and the great industrial superpower, and Britain wasn't bad either. And of course, so too was Russia. So although people talk about a victory for democracy and these sorts of things, in truth, it was a victory with countries that were able to outproduce Germany and Japan and Italy. Germany, the German army was an extraordinary thing in many ways, and the techniques they used, and they're very, very difficult to defeat one man on man in the Second World War. But actually, with the capabilities that we were able to deliver, especially with America, but also with Russia, it was always going to be a German loss, always. And it seems to me that you've got a big country and a small country, and with us providing little bits and pieces, we're not going to make the difference. And I'm not sure that even if the full weight of NATO was put behind the Ukraine, that we would prevail. I think it would be a bad thing to do anyway, but I'm not sure that we would prevail. I think NATO is not what it used to be.
Yeah, and that even presumes that it would be able, in the event that NATO did pull its full weight, that it would stay in the nuclear realm. I'm sorry, that it would stay in the conventional realm, which I think is pretty likely that it wouldn't. But even if it did, it still wouldn't work out in our favor. So that again gets back to what is your strategy? Because it shouldn't be hard to figure that out, but yet it is. And now here, kind of in a similar fashion, that was John Kirby, the spokesman for the White House. Well, here is the actual Secretary of Defense, Anthony Blinken, on the 4th of December, talking about kind of why he thinks they're doing more of this weapons production.
What we're working to do in the time that we have left is to give Ukraine, to give our own country, to give all the allies and partners that support Ukraine the strongest possible hand to use next year and beyond. If Ukraine determines that it needs to continue the fight, we want to make sure it has what it needs to continue that fight: the money, the munitions, the mobilized forces. If it chooses to engage in a negotiation, and that assumes, of course, that Putin and Russia have any intent of doing that, then again, we want to make sure it's from a position of strength. And from my perspective, I think what I'm trying to do, not just with Ukraine, but across the board, is to give the incoming administration the strongest hand to play in all of these areas.
Okay, a couple of things I want to talk about there. The second one, where he's mentioned about leverage for the incoming administration, I want to put that off the side for the moment. But let's look first of all at the foundation for his comments about why he's going to give these things to Ukraine. He says if they want to continue fighting into 2025, then this will give them the capacity to do that. Now, if in isolation, again, it's plausible to go down that path, but we're not in isolation. We've got nearly 3 years of graphic experience on the ground to be making that comment. So I'm just wondering what your understanding is from when you hear that and you look back at the wreckage of the last 3 years, that you think another package of ammunition and weapons is going to help the Ukraine side when it doesn't have the manpower to use it.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to summarize my sort of thinking in one sentence, is that Russia is operating according to a military strategy, and the West is operating according to a political narrative. And unfortunately, the military strategy is winning. And well, not unfortunately, I mean, it's just an obvious thing. So I think that what we see time and again, and I think we've seen a position where where initially it was about the defeat of Russia, then there's a walk back to now it's the recovery of all the territories in a negotiation, and now it's strengthening the hand into a negotiation. So what seems to happen is that every time that we're in a position where there was a position where there could have been a negotiation, Ukraine and the West choose not to negotiate, and the next time that we come around to a position, then we're in a worse position. So, as far as I can see, that the time has come to. I mean, I'm completely with you. The time has come to stop the killing, and the time has come to as well to accept that actually the whole philosophy and the whole idea of this support to Ukraine and its sort of support by the West was misguided. This always was about expansion of NATO. And we chose almost willfully to disregard Russia's legitimate security concerns. I mean, I'm a great fan of John Mearsheimer, and he suffers from something which most of the West in the conventional area don't, which is prescience. time and again, he's been right. And time and again, the conventional thinkers have been wrong. I think there's some subtleties which I might disagree with on John, but he's been right. And I think that everything that he said that would happen has happened. So I think that the time has come to look ourselves in the face and say, are we doing the right thing? If you look at, I mean, there are disagreements between how many, I very much doubt that as many Russians have been killed as the Ukrainians say, but I think the figures for the Ukrainian deaths are much more likely. And it's based really on the use of ammunition. You and I know that from the First World War, ammunition was artillery was the great killer. And if you've got artillery which is supported by drones and much higher technology so that it can be much more accurate, then the figures of sort of 400, 500,000 Ukrainians killed in action make sad sense to me. And it's those figures as well. I mean, the 500,000 is more than the British and Commonwealth forces lost in the whole of the Second World War. And for what was essentially a NATO ignoring or a decision which was made to expand NATO, and which was the great strategic thinkers such as George Kennan said this was a terrible mistake as far back as 1996. And I'm afraid to say they were proved right.
Yeah, there's really not much question about that. In my view, anyone who's willing to look at the actual evidence can come to really no other rational conclusion. I want to look at the second part of what he said in that last clip there with Anthony Blinken, that this is going to provide leverage for the incoming administration. Do you think that it actually will?
I think it's highly unlikely. I mean, I think that the question I've got in my mind is and I did it in the first article back in 2022, was what Russia's ultimate objectives would be. And it seemed to be, that seemed most likely to me, they would want to, if they decided that they couldn't get to negotiation, because that had been kiboshed in March of 2022, so that they would actually need to fight to get themselves in a secure military situation. And it seemed to me that the most natural feature was the Dnipro and the Dnipro River. And I wondered, therefore, whether they go as far up as the Dnipro River. And the other question I have in my mind still is Odessa, and whether or not they would actually have Odessa in mind. There was I think Putin was asked about a year ago by a journalist who said that if he was going to Odessa in 2025, should he have a Ukrainian or a Russian passport for that? And I think that's an open question, because my guess is that they will not have it as a target, but they could. And I would be thinking that way because I want to be more secure in the Black Sea, because they've suffered a lot as a result. The Russian Sevastopol and these places have suffered as a result of Western action and Ukrainian action. So I think the question is, how far will Putin and Russia go, and when will they feel that they've secured what they need to secure? I mean, I think they've achieved demilitarization, difficult to achieve denazification, but I think what they want is a long-term situation where they can feel that they're secure and that they won't have the prospect of Western missiles stationed on their borders in Ukraine.
Which is certainly obviously a very emotional point for them, has been since before the war. That's one of the things they cited is why they didn't want NATO on their border in Ukraine. But in terms of this leverage issue, we have that was obviously the outgoing administration. One of the senior advisors for Trump on the incoming administration is a General Kellogg, who was on U.S. television not long ago talking about this issue, which ironically is Gary showing on this headline there, where Trump is, I think today or maybe it was yesterday, saying that it's crazy for all the use of these U.S. missiles and he wishes Biden wouldn't do it. But before that, his advisor, General Kellogg, had a different view.
He's used it for psychological reasons, and Jack Keane made a great comment on that. He didn't use it because it was militarily effective, because it hit a city, not very much damage there at all. But he's kind of saying to the West, well, see what I can do. And this is one where people have backed off. President Biden's backed off. When the minute he said IRBM, ICBM, nuclear war, we said, oh my gosh, we can't go there. That's when you need to lean in, because he meaning Putin, he will not start a nuclear war in Europe. And you'd remind him, let me make sure you understand. The Brits have nuclear weapons. The French have nuclear weapons. We've got nuclear weapons. Don't go there. And we haven't really said that to him. So it's kind of a psychological play. And I think Jack Keane's got it right.
But why now?
John, here's what I'm really hoping. I'm hoping that Jake Sullivan talked to Michael Waltz, who's the incoming national security advisor, or President Biden has talked to President Trump and said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm really hoping that happened, because what he has done, Biden, through his action, he's actually given President Trump more leverage.
Really?
Because now he can pull back, he can go left, he can go right, he can do something. And I think what he did is he basically said, well, this is what I want to do. And I'm hoping there's something to this. I don't know, but it does give the President Trump more ability to pivot from that.
There's two things about what he said there I want to talk about. I want to talk about the first one second, which was, again, this issue about leverage. But let me ask you the question this time from a different perspective. To what extent is Vladimir Putin going to be leveraged by these weapons being flooded into the zone as opposed to them not going in? Is it going to constrain Trump and President Putin in some way?
I don't think it will. Again, I come back to it's a bit like V1s and V2s used during the Second World War. It didn't constrain Britain. We just kept going. And I think it's, in military terms, when you look at the amount of strategic bombardment by the Russians, and notice as well that they're targeting very specifically, not areas of, they're targeting parts of the energy infrastructure for the very good reason that actually that's a very good way of degrading the West, Ukraine's military capability. It's not much fun for the civilians. So I don't think it will help. I think it's sort of incidental, it's pinpricks. The danger, of course, is that it runs the risk of escalation. And the escalation one, I would be very cautious when anybody says that Putin won't use nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't think he will. But I think what is a worry is that, a bit like the Guns of Autumn, Barbara's, I've forgotten her second name, her work where actually we fell into the First World War through really no significant decision, but through sort of strategic miscalculation on both sides. And the great danger is that we end up in a nuclear war through strategic miscalculation.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. That was the second thing I wanted to say, because he, like so many in the West, I've seen both in the UK and in the US, both just almost like obviously they're not going to do that because that would be signing their own death warrant, as John Bolton once said here. But my concern is that assumes that it would be a well thought out situation, as opposed to what you're talking about, a strategic drift into, you just bump into it, like happened in World War I. Right now, we are waiting because for the third time, the Biden administration just, I think, less than 48 hours ago, authorized the use of ATACMS missiles, which hit a Russian air base in Bryansk region, I believe it was. And the Kremlin said there will be a response. Now, that hadn't happened yet. But we're wondering if it's going to happen. Apparently, it could be another Oreshnik. It could be something else with conventional missiles. There was a big one overnight we'll talk about in a minute. What are your concerns if Russia finally says they ramp up the target that's hit, maybe a power ministry in Kiev, which they have kept their hands off of so far? Is there anything that you worry about that could cause an escalation in response from the West?
I think the issue here, and I suspect that the Russians won't do this, but it's very difficult to. I mean, the issue is that they could actually start to look at some Western facilities which are producing some of the weapons that are being used against them, or other aspects of the Western military infrastructure outside Ukraine. I think they probably won't, but I wouldn't want to discount it. And I certainly would be worried if I was in these situations. Horizontal escalation is the other one, of course, and they've done that this has been done with the Houthis, who essentially have closed down the Red Sea. And I think there are other bits and pieces of infrastructure which could be vulnerable, and you could attack things in the North Sea and offshore, which could be vulnerable. I suspect that they won't, but I think the danger is that so far, as far as I can see, that whenever the Russians have said something, they have generally gone on and done it. And it's we who've been the ones who've bluffed and then had our bluff called by the Russians. So I think we've got to be super careful here.
Now, let me ask you a related question here. So Gary was just showing some of the video of that attack on the Bryansk area. So that's on Russian territory, where these missiles, which were enabled by the United States through Ukraine to be able to fire. Now, let me ask you this. What would we do if the situation was reversed and Russia, let's say that they were helping the Houthis, and they gave them missiles that hit an American missile destroyer in the Red Sea or so. Do you think that we would say, well, I mean, I know Russia gave them the stuff, but it was the Houthis, so we're just going to go after the Houthis? How do you think that would happen if it hit a U.S. or British warship?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, isn't it? Because I mean, we've tried our best to, our forces have tried our best to sort of suppress the Houthis, with not a huge amount of success. So, could you imagine us actually going further after Russia as a result of the use of Russian weapons in a horizontal escalation, which we were warned about and then chose to ignore the warning? It's a very, 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 very difficult thing. I suspect that at the moment, the thing about the Russians is that I'm not sure whether at the culminating point, but it's clear just looking at the increase in territory that's being secured and the collapse in Ukrainian units, that actually that they are winning, and they're winning at with some speed. So in their situation, I suspect that, and there are one or two hotheads who would like in Russia to actually do more, but I suspect that their decision, and I hope that their decision will be, they will keep going until they've achieved what they want to achieve, and that they will, unless there is something which causes significant loss of life in Russia, then we may just get away with it.
No.
But I think the best thing to do would be not to use these weapons, because there is no military benefit for them whatsoever to the Ukrainian war effort.
Now, and that leads into a separate issue related that also, in terms of this whole issue, that both the current administration and the advisor for the incoming administration talk about going to give leverage to Trump to negotiate or whatever. And yet, when you're talking militarily, because they are striking targets here, when you look at what Trump has said, and this is from this past Sunday when he was asked very specifically, are you going to start cutting back aid to Ukraine, and are you going for negotiated settlement? This is what he said.
Should Ukraine prepare for less aid from the United States after you're sworn into office?
Yeah, probably. Sure.
You said you can end the war in 24 hours. You've even said you want to try to end it before you're sworn
Well, I'm
into
trying
office.
to.
Before
I'm trying to end it
you're
if I
actively
can.
trying to?
I am.
Have you talked to President Putin?
No, I have not.
You haven't talked to President Putin
No, I have
since
not.
you've been
You
elected?
mean, no, well, I don't want to say that, but I haven't spoken to him recently.
So you've spoken to President Putin since you've
I
been
don't
elected?
want to say that. I don't want to say anything about that because I don't want to do anything that could impede the negotiation.
So here's one of my big frustrations, and maybe there's something I'm missing. You let me know if you think that's the case. If we have the current administration did everything it could for nearly 3 years to achieve a battlefield outcome to our desire, to our preference, and it utterly failed. And now then, as you just pointed out, the pace is increasing, that Russia is collecting more territory, killing more Ukrainian soldiers, etc. Industrial capacity is off the charts in comparison. You mentioned that earlier too. So all of the fundamentals that you can count and look show that there's no rational path to anything except a defeat on the Ukraine side. Now Trump has said, I'm going to negotiate. I want an immediate ceasefire. What then will this ammunition, how will that change the outcome, any at all, or help the incoming administration for leverage?
I can't see there's any leverage at all. Is it going to make a strategic difference to Putin and the Russians' miscalculations? I very much doubt it. It certainly, as I keep coming back to the model of V1s and the V2 rockets used against Britain. It didn't affect our calculations of what was happening on the battlefield at all. It didn't affect American calculations either. I mean, we were operating according to a strategy. Not everything went always right on the battlefield, but it mostly did. So I don't think it'll affect it at all. And it's very difficult to see what benefit there is at all in it. I mean, to me, if we are going to a negotiated answer, and I think the negotiation will either be a conditional or an unconditional surrender of Ukraine. And so what that looks like. So negotiation will be a conditional surrender of Ukraine, I would have thought. But if it's if the situation is that we're actually making things worse with the Russians at a time when we know we're getting closer and closer to negotiation, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to actually create a much more difficult political atmospheric with the Russians at a time when they're clearly in the ascendancy, and I'm afraid from the conventional Western point of view, they're close to victory. So to me, I think we would be much better being a little bit honest with ourselves and saying, yeah, this is a defeat. So it's about time that we actually start to work to get it to a closure, so that there is the end of the loss of life and the end of the loss of capital as well, and then think about how we start to repair this relationship with Russia.
Yeah, there's definitely no thought given to that, at least in the United States so far. I want to ask you a different kind of question here. So your framing a while ago is brilliant, and I'm sure I'm going to steal that and start using it from now on. That Russia seems to be operating by a military strategy. We're operating by a political narrative, and those things don't. The only one of those things works on the ground. The political narrative can work in minds, but it can't work on battlefields, and we're seeing that literally play out. So what do you think? Let's now jump ahead. It's 20th of January, and Trump has now been inaugurated. He is now the president of the United States, and so the next day he starts to act on these things. And he wants to have a negotiated settlement. If Trump goes in with even a modified version of the political narrative that I'm going to come out with something and I'm going to win and I'm going to do a good negotiation, but Putin is still we're going with, if it doesn't reflect what's actually happening on the ground, i.e. the territory that they've already had and what they may take, and actually what they've asked for. The minimum they've asked for, by the way, is all four of the provinces that they have annexed, and that includes all of Zaporizhia and Kherson, which right now Ukraine possesses some of. They would have to give that up, not just be beaten on the military. They would have to surrender that just to get to the entry-level terms. So the question is, what do you think would happen on both sides of the line if Putin says, I'm willing to talk to you, but until we get to this entry point, there's nothing to even discuss. And if the Trump side won't, then he'll just keep taking the action here. What would that leave? What does Trump have in his hands to play for negotiations?
I think Trump has in his hands something which is really significant, because I've always felt that, if you look back as far as 2000, I'll go slight deep dive, Danny, but probably relevant in this, which is, you look back as far as 9/11, and which was the very first country to call America and offer assistance, and it was Russia. And I've always felt that actually Russians, and some time I've been to St. Petersburg, but Russians, there is a strong sort of Western sort of or European feeling to the Russians. And I think actually that they've been, for some reason, we've sort of been incredibly Russophobic. I'm not saying it's a perfect country. It isn't. It's not as corrupt as Ukraine, though. And in many ways, it's much more democratic than Ukraine. But I've always felt that there is a sort of sense of European community amongst the Russians, and I think that it's about time that we stop treating them as an evil people run by an evil dictator, and start to think of them as people with their own interests, but also with their own desires as well. It's well worth. There are a couple of exceptionally good Oliver Stone's discussions with Putin are very interesting if you listen to them. There are a couple of very exceptional autobiographies as well, and you see it's much more subtle than Putin is just a despot. I think that what Trump has to offer is, I think, the building of a relationship. So it's clear that he's talked to Putin before, and I think having those conversations matters. If you look back to the end of the Cold War and how that with Gorbachev and Reagan and Thatcher, and the importance of relationships between these leaders, and having just the ability to actually pick up the phone and have a conversation. Think back to Khrushchev and JFK, and how important that was to stop that. And so building the relationship, and even if we don't disagree about things, I think that's an incredible thing that Trump does have to offer. And I think the sooner that he's in conversation with Putin, the better. And again, I'm not, I doubt that Putin's going to say, yeah, that's fantastic, we'll close it off in 24 hours. Yeah. But I think actually having that discussion and knowing that they're in discussion with the West at last would make a big difference. I still think that they will want to hold to their objectives, those 4 regions and the Crimea. But at least if they're in discussion, we can start to talk as opposed to keep the further deaths. Like you, the thought of however many Ukrainians are killed every day is just appalling.
It is. I want to go down a little bit. I'll go tag off of what you just said there in terms of kind of how the West views this Russophobic kind of situation. And even in this very late hour, it's not the 11th hour, it's more like 11:59 in terms of where I think where this is going to end up going. Trump is definitely coming in. He's going to seek a negotiated settlement, whatever terms ends up getting. But I'm going to show you a clip here from Keir Starmer earlier this month, so not long ago. Even in light of all of these things that we know that the negotiations are coming, that militarily, I mean, his advisor have to be able to tell him that there is no path to even avoid defeat if the war just kept going. So he certainly has to be aware of that. But yet here is what Keir Starmer said and how he characterized the situation.
It's right that we support Ukraine, but we must be clear that it's also deeply in our own self-interest to do so. What would it mean for our values, for democracy, commerce, and liberty? It means they are weakened. It means that other autocrats would believe they could follow in Putin's example. And it means that our security, stability, and prosperity would be damaged.
But he's setting this stage to where he's telling all the people in the UK, and by extension into the West as well, that if the outcome that almost certainly is going to be the outcome, that Russia comes out in a positive situation, then now he said that all of our future is going to be at risk, et cetera, security and democracy, any other way you want to look at. Why do you suppose they would say something like that when he almost certainly is not going to get the outcome he wants?
I've got to be a bit careful here, Danny, because I'm still working, and the very good company that I work for is quite closely associated with local government. So it would be quite wrong for me to criticise the British government. But what I can do is sort of give you a few thoughts on the extent to which our values are being threatened, the extent to which we do feel threatened. It feels to me that the Europeans don't feel threatened, in truth, and they don't feel threatened because if they did, they would be mobilizing. And we're not mobilizing. Yeah, we're not spending 6% of GDP. We're even questioning whether we can get to 2.5% of GDP or 2%. So we're not mobilizing. I think as well, there is a sense in the across the West, across the European Union and elsewhere in ministries of cognitive dissonance. I don't think they can somehow see and that because we're operating according to a political narrative, they can't see that the narrative is failing and that the Russia's military strategy is winning. There is also a sort of almost a willful desire to actually ignore and assume that this all started in 2014-15 with the Maidan Revolution and then 2022. Whereas the truth is that the warnings have been there for decades. I talked a little bit about George Kennan's prescient warnings in 1996. Another one, of course, was Bill Burns when he was the Moscow ambassador and sent the "niet" means "niet," and in that, that people often assume this is all about Putin. In it, he was very clear and said this is a major issue for Russia in the round, and that it's felt across the region. So again, we've willfully ignored Russia's concerns about this. When you look at the Bucharest summit, what happens after the Bucharest summit? The Russians warn us and say that Ukraine and Georgia, if you take them into Ukraine, these are red lines for us. First thing that happens is that in Georgia, off goes the. They start to try to sort out. I always get confused by the two names. I can't remember which of the minorities in there.
North Ossetia and the
Ossetia, and they that kicks off for the Georgians decide they're going to suppress it. And the first thing that happens is Putin comes in, and that's quickly the suppression is quickly suppressed. And of course, NATO says, yeah, well, actually, we didn't really. When we said we want you in, that doesn't mean to say that you can go and do whatever you like. And they learned a lesson from that. But we seem to be willfully ignoring the history that runs up to the moment that the special military operation starts. And it's like trying to navigate without actually having a chart. It's not good at sea because you usually bump into things, and it's not good in strategic world, if you don't have a proper understanding of the historical context, let's not forget that that in the Second World War, Russia was invaded, and in the Second World War, Russia lost 26 million people.
Yeah.
So of course they're concerned about this, and I'm not saying that we necessarily want to go and be bosom buddies straight away, but to ignore Russia's military their legitimate security concerns. I mean, how would America feel if China was suddenly building new forces in Mexico? I suspect that neither administration would like it that much.
I assure you they would not.
There's also the other issue as well is the issue of energy, which is what I do now, and the Europeans have done very badly as a result of this war. I mean, to the extent that it looks to me like Germany, which is the beating heart of the European Union in terms of money, is in deep trouble as a result of turning off Russian gas. And again, that's a very significant issue, which we seem to be very happy just to ignore.
And let me ask you again, in the remaining time we have left here, let's tag off on that, because that is a negative, but it could possibly be used as a positive in that we have to find some way to get to the point that you mentioned earlier. Russia, the United States, and the West, they're going to be they're not changing addresses. We're both going to live there. So over time, it's a requirement that we got to figure a way to get back to where we can at least coexist without always worrying about whether a nuclear missile is going to fly somewhere. So the economic pain being suffered by some in Western Europe of this lack of the cheap Russian gas they had, being impetus once this is over, however it ends up getting settled, and it will. Once that happens, how do you see the process? How long might it take to start the process to where we can get back to some kind of just common, decent relations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, my as I say, I work in the energy industry now. I work in the renewables industry, but I'm interested in the whole lot. And there is a sort of general assumption, and it's a meme really, which is that you can just transfer from hydrocarbons to renewables. I mean, it's absolute rubbish. You can't. My industry is the offshore industry, offshore wind, offshore renewables. We're critically dependent on diesel. We're critically dependent on other parts of the hydrocarbons, and we will be for at least another 20 to 30 years. So we've got to accept that actually the hydrocarbons will continue to be in the mix for a significant amount of time. I think the danger, is that Russia is already shifting its export markets towards India. It's just signed a deal with India. It's a big supplier of Chinese gas, and it could be that they've got to the stage where they've decided actually that, okay, you don't want our gas, so we're going to sell it elsewhere. By the time we come to say, actually, we've changed our mind, it's too late. I hope not, though, and I think not. And I think that Germany is the key here. And I think that if Germany were to actually walk back from the position and it would need American agreement. Well, it wouldn't need American agreement, but it would be really helpful to have American agreement. That if there was agreement that actually that we were to start having debates about the use of Russian energy, then that'd be a good thing. People don't realize that Russia is an energy superpower. The thing that going back to the Second World War, America was the oil and gas superpower in the Second World War, and it made a huge difference. And of course, the Russians were well supplied by the Caucasus, and the British had lots of coal. So, one of the reasons that we won the Second World War was that we didn't run out of energy. But actually, that situation has now changed, and America is although it's an exporter of oil and gas, it's a net importer overall. Yeah. So you require about 6 million barrels a day, sorts of figures. And the whole of Europe is, with the exception of Norway requires external oil and gas. So we're critically dependent on this stuff, and to actually to cut our nose off to spite our face is doing us. And potentially the EU damage, and potentially for the EU irreparable damage, because if Germany is no longer able to act as the banker for the EU, then who knows where the EU will end.
Yeah, well, we'll probably be finding out about that, and one can certainly hope that with the incoming administration, that Trump, who is historically focused on deals, et cetera, will recognize the pros and cons of things, and whatever the rhetoric he uses. I'm told by people who have briefed him in private in the background that he's very no nonsense. Show me the spreadsheet, the pros and the cons, et cetera.
Yeah.
So one hopes that will translate into policies that actually make sense coming out, that we can get this off the table and the risk for everybody back to manageable.
Yeah, no, I listened as well. I look at one or two of the potential appointments as well. I look at J.D. Vance, whose Hillbilly Elegy I read. It's terrific. But also I've heard him talk in the depths of the night and Congress, talking about this war and about in a very pragmatic way. And I would think that I've forgotten her name. Tracy, what's her name?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard. She seems to be have her head screwed on as well. So let's hope that the voices of strategic common sense prevail.
Because there are some good ones, so it's not all bad news. So we'll have to hope that works out. But absolutely delighted to have you on today. Thank you so much for coming on today, and we look forward to having you back soon.
No, it's a pleasure, and thank you again for all your efforts. It's invaluable.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we appreciate you guys for watching with us. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done it. If you're new to the channel, we always appreciate that a lot. Also, we are on podcast now. For those who don't get a chance to always watch on the video, just go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, and you will find us waiting there for you. And in the meantime, we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.